Welcome, everyone. My name is Seth Dellinger, and I'm here on behalf of the Feldenkrais Guild of North America communications team. And it's my pleasure to be talking today with Dan Clurman. So welcome, Dan.
Hi, Seth.
Dan is a teacher of many different things, from communications and coaching. He's a professor of psychology, and he is also a Feldenkrais practitioner and a teacher of meditation. And that's the area that we're going to focus on in particular today. And anything else just in terms of introducing who you are that you want to add to that?
I'm a big fan of the Feldenkrais method. I've been doing it for a while, and it's definitely an integral part of my life.
Right. And you told me just before we started that for 25 years or so, you have actually been experimenting with combining practices from Feldenkrais and meditation. So I thought maybe we could start there. Some people watching this video might be fairly new to Feldenkrais. There's an individual situation where a practitioner works with a single client. But what we were going to talk about today is the group class situation, which is called Awareness Through Movement. And I thought maybe you and I could just sort of flesh out what that is together. But I'll just sort of begin by saying, if you've never tried it, if you go to a Feldenkrais class, you do Awareness Through Movement, the teacher is going to be guiding you through movement, usually lying on the floor, although it could be in a chair or standing. And one of the things that people notice right away is that the movement is way slowed down compared to other movement practices. And there's a big emphasis on your experience of how you're moving while you're moving. And then what happens, what changes, it can be really surprising to us because the mechanism of change isn't just, oh, I'm moving my joints around. So that's an initial foray, and maybe you'd like to add more just in terms of how you see awareness through movement.
I think that describes it well. The challenge of the lesson, or the opportunity of lessons, awareness through movement lessons, is to learn how you do what you do. It's the learning how you organize yourself in a field of gravity to do anything, to get up, to sit down, to reach for something, to look around you. So it's extremely practical because throughout the entire day, we're having to orient ourselves to do things in gravity. And also the awareness of movement lessons present an opportunity to perceive your own sense of self, how it is you're being you in this gravitational field, doing the simple tasks of the lesson or of what you're doing during the day. So it has tremendous relevance and practicality as you're doing it. Plus, it can be a lot of fun. And you have, as you're saying, this often you have surprisingly powerful results from doing so little. That's the kind of paradoxical aspect.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said something about your sense of self, because that's why, if I work out at the gym, I'm going to get some kind of results. I could feel great after doing that. But my sense of who I am isn't likely to shift a whole lot in that process. I can actually feel almost like, it might not be an exaggeration to say, sometimes I do awareness through movement, I almost feel like a different person by the end. And one of the concepts from Dr. Feldenkrais that I want to bring in, because where we're going in this conversation, because of the particular way you teach, is also including our experience of perception. But just to kind of get there gradually, Feldenkrais had an idea called the self-image, which is part of a way we might explain what's happening in awareness through movement. So I wonder if you'd like to also just say for the viewers your sense of what's meant by the self-image and how we can work with that.
I would imagine that each Feldenkrais practitioner has a different way of talking about that.
Yeah.
So this is just my perception of that. I think of the self-image is that we have a way of mapping our own physicality into the environment. That is, as I reach for something, I feel the way I'm reaching, and I'm having a sense of how far I can reach and what the limitations are, and what I can and cannot do, in a sense. And that starts to form as part of my image of who I am is the possibilities that exist for me in my embodiment. So we're doing that from an early age all the way through. You can see how that changes from how babies start to orient themselves to their environment. They, rolling around, reaching, knocking over, grabbing things. As you get through different ages, that changes. As you're a younger person, you have a certain sense of your capabilities. As you get into another age, middle age, that changes. As you get into older age, that changes. That as we move about through life, we're, in a sense, developing different qualities of our own self-image, of our capabilities, of our functioning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this can change when we do awareness through movement. How does that happen?
Very definitely. So with awareness, one of the things that we often get into as human beings is we develop habits. And habits often consist of repetitive action that is like a stereotype. It's a shortcut. So we don't have to keep figuring everything out each time. We have, in some sense, developed these habits to allow us to navigate through life a little more easily. So they're natural. It's just that if you don't adapt to your challenges, new challenges, and you stay sometimes stuck in a habit, it can be quite constraining. You can see that psychologically. Certain mental habits you need to update, or certain physical habits. For example, a client once trying to work out, was an athlete in his 20s. He's going back to work out in his 40s, and he's trying to work out like he was 25 and he injures himself.
Right.
It's like that was, that old habit of just pushing as hard as possible. It might have worked when you had more resilience when you're in your 20s. It doesn't work the same way when you're in your 40s and you have a different kind of body.
Right.
So the awareness through movement lesson gives you a structure for maybe doing some basic functional thing like rotation. People, they're backing their car out of the driveway. They have to turn and look behind themselves. We've done it hundreds and hundreds of times, so we have a certain habit for doing that. But maybe you can do that more easily, more efficiently. But you need to try out different things. Suppose as you turned, you turned more from your pelvis rather than just from your neck, or you included the sense of your ribs being involved, or maybe taking your eyes and letting them lead you. There's a lot of different things that you can add variety to a movement pattern, and an awareness or movement lesson gives you that possibility for adding the variety and then noticing, how does that change what you're doing? How does that affect how you organize that action?
Mm-hmm. And so if I go to class and then I'm driving home and I realize it's way easier to actually check the cars behind me before I change lanes, I almost have a different sense of just my capacity to be in the world. Like I could have more confidence. I've worked with clients because this is such a common thing that we find as Feldenkrais practitioners. It's really frightening to drive on the highway if they have limited rotation. So it's a question of mobility, but it really does become a question of identity in that way.
Oh, it has a big impact. I mean, that's a good example. For example, I've often worked throughout my whole life with older population, and that's a place where people start to notice diminishing capacities.
Mm-hmm.
Some of which is due to aging, but some of it is just certain patterns, habits, They were good in an earlier period, they're not so good in this period. An example is one woman who is an avid gardener, gets shoulder pain doing gardening. We do a awareness through movement lesson that has to do with just bringing in more of your body, more of your core body into the movement. So you're not doing it all just from your wrist and your shoulder. And her pain decreases by 30% in 45-minute lesson.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's remarkable, but it has such an impact for that person and their own sense of identity.
Right.
That maybe they're not as diminished as they think, and maybe their association with getting older isn't so negative as it is often seen to be from a social point of view.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned again the sense of identity, and I want to come to what I mentioned in the beginning, that you have a unique approach that is actually different than some Feldenkrais practitioners, plenty in common, but also other things you bring in. And since you also teach meditation, could you speak a little bit to meditative practice? Of course, there's many forms, but what are some of maybe the areas of overlap and difference between awareness through movement? And then if you like, maybe you could even begin to describe how you have brought them together as well.
Okay. So there's all kinds of meditation, and it would be easy to say Feldenkrais awareness through movement lessons are a form of meditation, particularly if you look at it from, what's popular now is mindfulness meditation. That a Feldenkrais lesson asks you to be aware of what you're doing, to be mindful of what you're doing, which means to not only be doing the movements, but also to be noticing how you're doing what you're doing, the effects of it, in a relatively neutral, observing way, relatively neutral, so that you're taking note as you're doing what you're doing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or as you're just simply even sitting, which is more popular, say, in some meditative forms. So it's that sense of paying attention in a relatively neutral way. That's one type of meditation, a mindfulness meditation, and that most definitely goes with awareness through movement lessons. It's a moving mindfulness meditation. And then there are other types of meditative inquiries that explore different aspects of our experience. It could be our perceptual experience, sort of what we're talking about with seeing, for example. And that would mean that when we do a awareness through movement lesson, it's affecting our own sense of embodiment. We're playing with how we are organized in gravity and how we do what we do, how we reach out, how we turn, how we sit up, how we stand up. When we do those activities, we are actively engaging just one part of it, our eyes. And one of the interesting things about Feldenkrais lessons is that they often focus on the use of the eyes and how the eyes relate to the organization of the rest of the body. And so I've been playing a lot with bringing the eyes into a lot of the awareness through movement lessons. And as I've done that over the years, it's very helpful for people. There's a way in which they start to, in a sense, wake up their sensory system. They start to notice how, as they move in more effective or more graceful ways, their sense of seeing in their environment starts to also change. Colors become more activated and alive. The sense of textures is there. The sense of maybe having a habitual focus, which is very centralized, that's kind of due to our over-attention to electronic devices, starts to spread out and move towards the periphery, and which we were much more acquainted with before we got into electricity. It's a lot of our evolution was where we had natural rhythms of light and dark. And as, for example, people's seeing opens up and becomes less centralized, the sense of their bodies also can start to relax more. And there's a sense of a greater depth of their way of inhabiting themselves. The feeling of the body starts to be less contracted and more open. So this is something I've been playing with seeing, and it's most people really enjoy it. It's very beneficial for them.
Mm. Yeah, you gave me an example when we were talking informally that I'd love to go back to because I think it illustrates this. But you were just talking about, and this relates to me, like city dwellers. What is the environment like? I mean, people who can see the room I'm in, they can see the rectangle and all the straight lines and whatnot. And then you mentioned being with your wife in Bali at a gamelan performance that was outdoors and the wide open space. And I'm sure many people who just love to go for a hike on the weekend also know that, you know, in addition to the fresh air, there's a sense of I feel different when I can see for miles and miles around me. And the sense I have from having been in touch with you a little bit is that you're deliberately interested in this, not just our perception, but our relationship to the world around us, and how it's like my body feels different, but the world looks different. And so like part of how I feel is based on the world, not just my body. And you're playing with that. Is that a fair kind of?
Yes, that most definitely. Yeah, yeah. That as you do a lesson and as it affects you, it's quite naturally going to affect your relationship to the environment. You know, you could say you and this environment are always given together. You know, we're always in an environment. And part of how we know ourselves is our sense of locatedness within an environment. You know, that sense of perception can change with a lesson where, you know, in our society and in urban environments in particular, we often have this sense of being in a kind of compressed space, you know, that we're closed in, we're surrounded by our man-made objects, and we have a sense of limited space often. Mm-hmm. And with a lesson, and our bodies adapt to that. You know, we often have a sense of compression in our bodies in a way. As you play with a lesson and you connect it with seeing and you feel the field of vision relaxing and opening up, and in a certain sense, maybe taking in a wider view, a more global perspective, the body also starts to open up and relax. Mm-hmm. And that can happen even in more cramped kinds of spaces in this, you know, more urban settings. It is very akin to the feeling sometimes of being in wide open spaces where you're at the seashore and you're looking out at the ocean and the sky and you're drinking in the sky. And when you have that experience, your body relaxes and feels open in that space. You become, in a sense, you feel more spacious. Mm-hmm. And that affects how you relate to people as well, and, you know, everything else. So I've been playing with that a lot in ATM lessons, that sense of how do you open up the space of the body, particularly through the use of the eyes and being attentive to seeing, and then how do you naturally start to just bring that into your life? How does that affect the way you relate to where you're living, to people, mm-hmm. to that sense of self?
Yeah, so just to draw this out a little more, because you shared some recordings, so I had a chance to listen to some of your teaching. And one of the classes that I heard, you also placed a lot of emphasis on a kind of an inner seeing, like seeing the inside of my body. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, and that's a whole style of meditation that's part of certain practices, Tibetan practices. You know, there's a meditation on what's called the central channel of the body, the inner space of the body. And there are some contemporary teachers that do that. One of them is Judith Blackstone. That is that we have a sense of the space, the interior space of the body. And it's not anything all that esoteric. It's when you're breathing, you can sense that. You know, we as we breathe, the space, the internal space of the body opens up, and then as we exhale, it contracts, and it's definitely a felt sense of that region of ourselves. When you become sensitized more to that inner space and start to, you could say, consciously inhabit it or occupied, or whatever word you might want to use. It's a lived sense for you. It's almost a little bit like coming home to yourself, because in a way, in our society, we're very used to treating our bodies as if they're another kind of object. That there's a great line in one of James Joyce's short stories. I think it's Mr. Duffy lived a short distance from his body and cast awkward sideways glances at it. And in some ways, we treat our bodies as if there's some sort of thing that we have to just march through our day. But another aspect of an awareness and movement lesson is you really start to feel the presence of the body, and it becomes alive, and it's the whole sensory richness of all the senses, seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, smelling. They wake up as you have the sense of really inhabiting or participating or being with the body, mind, organism, all one thing. And particularly that sense of resting or being aware of that inner space. And the sense of connectedness of the inner space to the outer space. And that's particularly through the breath, that we live in this space, that we are always located in space. As we breathe, we're in a certain sense taking in the space. We have the inner space that is revealed to us through the breath. And we breathe out, we connect to the space. That the outer and the inner spaces are always connecting, and the breath is the bridge. Well, as people pay attention to that and start to feel that inner space, most people report it, they say it's like coming home to themselves. There's a kind of connectedness to being here, to being alive, and to just being present to oneself in a very fundamental way.
So when you were talking just now, and I was just following your description of the breath, like it was just so obvious to me. Well, it's really simple to kind of imagine the air out there. And yeah, I mean, listening inwards, we do that. But then to try to do both of those things at the same time, like I could be present to the space inside my chest and the air in the room, what I felt was, I don't know how I do that, but I have to adjust something. It was like just my whole sense of, and I could imagine if this is a new idea, we could also have that voice that says, am I even doing this right? But it's like a feeling of trying to perceive in a different way and discovering, there's something fresh in that. And so you used the word coming home to your body, and you've been doing this for quite a while now. I'm just kind of I'm relating my experience, but I'm curious to hear more about, I guess, how you discovered this, or how this particular approach has made a difference for some of the people you've worked with.
I'm very interested in actually picking up on what you were saying, because I think there was something in there that was just the essence there. Can I pick up on that? And then,
of course, yeah.
So when you were saying when you started to notice that, here you are in your room, here's the space, and you feel the space internally through the breath and that sense of occupying this region of the body, and then the two of them together, in a subtle or maybe not so subtle way, there's also a certain adjustment to, well, maybe I'm not that separate from my environment as I think I am. Maybe me here, this organism and this space, that the space itself is a common connector, is a common ground in which, I'm occurring as a body-mind organism, and my environment is occurring, and that the space is a common factor for us. Because the space allows for all these things to occur. It allows for me to be embodied this way. It allows for the presence of different things in the room. So there's a sense of a little bit of more of a unification with one's environment. It's organism plus environment. But that becomes very, it's not just an abstract idea. It's a felt idea, physically.
Right. Right.
And that's a very healing quality for a lot of people.
Mm.
That as they experience that, can be a sense of maybe relaxation of the whole body into, where I'm living and what I'm doing. That is often felt quite clearly in nature.
Mm-hmm.
People, in their experiences of nature and the openness of nature, the space of nature, start to feel like they're a part of the whole.
Right.
And so I think you can have that same experience doing a lesson and just focusing a little bit more on that's seeing the space, feeling the space, noticing there's a connectedness.
Right.
It's
Right.
not really an esoteric thing. It's very practical because we're doing it all the time anyway.
Right. Well, it's so interesting is there's a word we could use for what we're talking about, which is to say we're talking about the phenomenological experience. In other words, how it feels, how I sort of perceive and whatnot. But it seems like it bridges over into almost like what we might call conceptual in terms of like, what is this world that I live in? So
Yeah.
it's this funny thing. I don't think I have anywhere near the experience you do with meditation, but one of the practices I've encountered in my experience with meditation is something that's sometimes called a big mind meditation.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, you're just really concentrating on the sky and this vast distances in all directions. And so if we describe it that way, we might say that's phenomenological. Your attention is paying it, you're just noticing a broader physical space. But what changes is that sense of self, that sense of, and it's sort of like, I think this is another idea, maybe particularly in Buddhist meditation, is like what I see or what I perceive. Again, maybe the phenomenology. It's partly based on my ideas about who I am and what the world. So it feels like you're kind of crossing over in between phenomenology and like actual self-concept.
Right, but it's a physical kind of thing with the Felden. That's the beauty of Feldenkrais lessons. It's not something that is conceptual. It's something that you're investigating it based on your own experience of doing a lesson.
Right. It's not an intellectual practice when we're doing awareness
No,
through
not
movement.
that much. It's very
Yeah.
physical. And also it
Yeah.
doesn't have to arrive at any conclusions. It's just sort of what's it like to be alive,
Mm-hmm.
standing up, walking, sitting,
Yeah.
turning left, turning right,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's real basic, and so it has all these other dimensions, and it certainly improves your efficiency and movement, but it has these other dimensions which we're talking about, the sense of self, the self-image, what's my perception like. It's really going to this sense of what's it like to be alive
Mm-hmm.
and to be in this gravitational field and to be doing what we do together. So that's the meditative aspect. I think meditation, it can be just really, it's fundamentally just about what's it like being alive, doing what you're doing, perceiving in the way you're perceiving. It's an open question, being who you are. Who are you?
Mm-hmm.
It's just an open inquiry in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So we're, in a certain sense, we're very often doing that throughout our lives. At each phase of our lives, we're often curious about, who am I now?
Mm-hmm.
How am I navigating through this part of my life, in a very simple physical way?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do I adapt to these new challenges that I'm facing after an injury or after I'm ill or being with another person or being with a group? Those are all very embodied questions.
And it seems to me also that part of what you're emphasizing here is that there's a way that perception, it's always happening, so we can almost forget about it. So we're bringing our attention not only as we normally do in awareness through movement to notice how I'm moving, in this case my arms or the movement of my jaw as I speak, those kinds of
Exactly.
things. But when I look at you, I might not really have the sense of I'm doing something. Like seeing feels somehow it's just, he's in
Just
front of me, so
happening.
I see him. But you're inviting people to really feel into perception. you might say.
Most definitely. Yeah. Yeah. You are. Yes. I mean, and of course, we have to normalize it. We have to be habitual in order to just get through the day. But there are some interesting moments perceptually that almost everybody has a sense of something new emerging or something beautiful happening. Sitting, looking at a sunset, and seeing the colors and feeling how the colors are affecting your sensibility, and that sense of how something in nature can be so beautiful and how it affects you physically.
Mm-hmm.
And that you're, or looking at a painting or looking at someone, and you have this sense of contact, or you have this sense of visually the richness of the colors. I mean, these are things that as human beings we delight in, and we have a long track record of leaving art around as a kind of residue of these experiences, you could say, beyond that. But we like to celebrate our sensory experiences. We're creatures of the senses. So awareness through movement lessons are great for waking all that up, as well as being very functional too. But I particularly like that aspect of lessons because I guess I really appreciate that sense of wakefulness and aliveness, and again, the beauty that brings to human life. Because in some ways, there's so much suffering in life. It's nice to celebrate something that is also quite beautiful in life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a really beautiful perspective. I know that at a certain point, when I got more interested in the space around me in Feldenkrais practice, I realized that it is possible to do awareness through movement almost as if it is my body in a vacuum and that the environment isn't there. Because I might have my eyes closed, might be paying attention to my shoulder blade because that's the focus. And I can work something out there. But when I started getting interested in this aspect myself, and of course, Feldenkrais had this background in judo. I mean, there's opponents moving through space. You need to know where they are. It's very, but there's a way we could forget about the outside of the body when we close our eyes. But what's really fantastic is to sort of begin to trust the idea that I can sense something that I'm not physically touching, like the space around me has a feeling to it. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what I thought of just when you were talking about the beauty of the sunset and this feeling of aliveness.
Most definitely. I think you're really bringing up a key aspect, which is this a little more than just a straight ahead awareness movement lesson, but Feldenkrais was very attuned to this through being a martial artist, I think, is that our awareness of space has a very large impact on our sense of who we are and how we are. And this relates again to that meditative practice you were talking about, the big sky, big mind. So that is a meditative practice, which is quite wonderful. It's very common in Tibetan Buddhism, of sky gazing. You go to a place that's kind of high up where you have an unimpeded view of the sky, and you have the sense of looking at the sky and releasing yourself into that openness and feeling like you're breathing in the openness of the sky. It's a very specific practice. And it has a very wonderful effect in that sense of space or openness is unimpeded. It has no boundaries. Whatever is appearing in it, space can accommodate it with no issue. It's the same thing as, in a room, whatever objects are in the room, the space allows for the presence of those objects to be in that room. If you didn't have any space, there wouldn't be a room. So we can, once we start playing with that, and just for the simple thing you're talking about, noticing how space affects us while we're doing a lesson.
Mm-hmm.
I bring that in for people and just saying, okay, now you felt how you moved, how your pelvis connects to your feet. What's it like as you're standing and you're being in the room? You're feeling your feet, you're feeling your pelvis, but you're also in the room. How's that affecting you? People have an experience where they orient to it.
Yeah, I just really appreciated that last bit of what you said, because people, I think, can try this right away. And I don't know if you have another thing, but I'm just wondering if there are like some simple things you might suggest, um, just in daily life, even how people can bring a little bit more of this into their experience.
Um, yeah, there's some very simple lessons for that people can play with for sure. Um, I have some of them on my website. If people want to try them, they just can go there to, if it's Feldenkrais Method Guide.com, and then the audio lessons are incorporate what we're talking about. These Feldenkrais lessons that incorporate the sense of space and how you relate to space. I think it's as simple as as you're taking a walk outside, you can simply notice how your gaze is directed. Where are you looking? And what are you taking in? Often when people walk, they get into a habitual use of their eyes and their head. And of course, maybe you have to look down to notice if the pavement's uneven, that sort of thing. But do you ever glance up? Do you take in the environment? And what's it like, for example, if you tend to habitually do look down, when you shift up and your head rises up and it starts to rest a little more vertically on top of your skeleton and your eyes open up and take in the environment, how does that affect your sense of who you are and how you're connecting to your environment? It's a very simple thing, but when I do that with clients, they often notice something like, gee, I never look around. I don't even notice what's going on around me. Half the time, I'm just looking down, focused on the pavement, and I don't even notice the vegetation that's around me, or just the things that I pass every day without, there's a lot of beauty around me, the gardens, for example, or just the architecture. And that could be one thing, and it changes people's moods, a sense of their own embodiment in their locale. But also, it can be something you notice as simple as sitting in your room, feeling the presence of your body, and then looking at the room and noticing, how do the things that are placed in your room, these are the things that you've used to create your sense of home, and like you have a painting up, or you have a little sculpture up, or you have this type of curtain or rug or whatever it might be. As you sit there and you just notice the presence of these things, how are they affecting you? How are they affecting you in terms of your experience? You have them up. They're reminders of something for you. We often forget all these things that we have in our house that we've put there to affect us. So it could be as simple as just taking that in and noticing physically how these things affect you. Just feeling, what's it like? These are really simple ideas, but I do that, for example, when I have people do a awareness movement lesson that's about some of the things we've been talking about. At the end, we just sit there and take a look around your room and notice, what's your room like for you? What's it like living where you are? And people report all kinds of things. They're often quite surprised. I mean, some people say, well, one thing is, I never really look out my windows, and now I'm looking out my window and I'm really enjoying seeing these trees out there in my yard.
Mm-hmm.
Or I brought this painting back, 10 years ago. It's been sitting here. I haven't even noticed it for the last 2 years. And now I know why I bought that painting and what it's reminding me of. And I think I want to revisit that, because that was an important moment in my life.
Yeah. So there's a lot of meaning and just our identity actually embedded all around us. And it feels like just a beautiful invitation to bring more awareness to that.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
So Thanks so much for this conversation, Dan. We'll have the information of if people want to get to know you better. We'll put that near this video so they can check it out.
And if they want to do some lessons, they can go to the link and there's
Yeah,
a bunch of lessons that they can try out.
fantastic. And meanwhile, I hope everyone looks around their room and looks out the window.
Yes, I hope everyone has a yeah, a fun day experimenting with this, and I'm pretty sure, you know, from what we talked about, I don't think any of this is new in some ways. We're just really talking about what it's like to be human and be alive, and how the Feldenkrais method can really help people play with that sense. You know, it's for this magazine called Sensability, to play with that sensibility.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Dan.
And thank you, Seth, for a really enjoyable conversation too.